I learned the truth by accident, which is how most real betrayals reveal themselves, not with drama, but with carelessness. Before I tell you how it unfolded, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from right now? Drop your city or state in the comments, because stories like this have a way of finding the people who need them most. My name is Margaret Hale. I'm 69 years old, and for most of my life I believed that patience was the highest form of love. I believed that if I stayed calm, stayed generous, stayed quiet, everything would sort itself out. I believed that family meant safety. The night that belief cracked wasn't loud. It was a dinner party, when I wasn't supposed to hear clearly because I'd excused myself early, claiming fatigue. I paused halfway up the staircase when I heard my name spoken in a tone people only use when they think the subject is already gone. My sister laughed softly. My nephew said something about timing. Someone else mentioned the house, the investments, how everything would be simpler once Margaret isn't around anymore. Not dead yet, just not around. As if my presence were an inconvenience they were waiting out. I stood there in the dim light, hand resting on the banister I'd paid for myself, and felt something inside me settle, not break. That's important. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I listened. I learned how long they'd been planning. I learned they'd already divided my life into columns, property, savings, accounts, like items on a spreadsheet waiting to be unlocked. And the most painful part wasn't the money. It was the certainty in their voices, the confidence that I was already finished, already fatting, already theirs to distribute. I went to bed that night and slept better than I had in months, not because I was at peace, but because I was awake. You see, when people think you're waiting to die, they stop watching what you do while you're still living. They don't notice the files you organize, the calls you make, the decisions you quietly put into motion. They don't imagine you'll change anything, because they've already written the ending without you. That was their mistake. And as I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling of the home I built, I made myself a promise I had never made before. I would let them believe exactly what they wanted to believe. Right up until the moment it cost them everything they thought they were waiting to inherit. The next morning, nothing looked different, and that was exactly how I wanted it. I made coffee the way I always did, black, no sugar, standing at the counter instead of sitting down because old habits die slowly. My sister chatted about errands. My nephew scrolled on his phone, barely looking up. They spoke to me with that softened politeness people use when they think age has already begun to hollow someone out. I played my part well. I mentioned feeling tired more often. I joked about not keeping up like I used to. I even laughed when my sister suggested we should start thinking ahead about practical matters. What they didn't see was how carefully I was watching. Every word, every glance, every assumption. By mid-morning, I was alone in the study, the one room they rarely entered because it bored them. That's where I kept the real story of my life. Folders, ledgers, original deeds, old contracts, insurance policies, trust drafts I'd never finalized because I'd been too busy taking care of everyone else. I didn't rush. Revenge built on panic collapses. What I was planning required patience and precision. I made a list, not of what they'd done wrong, but of what they believed to be true. They believed I was disorganized. They believed I trusted them blindly. They believed everything important had already been settled years ago. Each belief was a door they'd left unlocked. I began calling professionals I hadn't spoken to in years. Quiet calls, respectful calls, the kind that don't raise alarms. My attorney, my financial advisor, an estate planner recommended by a woman who'd once told me, the smartest people never announce their plans. By lunchtime, I had 3 appointments scheduled under the guise of updating records. No one questioned it. Why would they? In their minds, updates were harmless, temporary, too late to matter. That afternoon, as sunlight stretched across the floor and my family discussed vacations they planned to take someday, I realized something essential. They weren't waiting for my death out of cruelty. They were waiting because it was convenient, because it allowed them to avoid confronting me, avoid honesty, avoid the risk that I might say no. And that understanding gave me clarity. I wasn't going to explode their world in anger. I was going to let it collapse under the weight of its own assumptions, step by step, quietly, legally, completely. Over the next few weeks, I became invisible by choice. I stopped offering opinions at the dinner table. I deferred decisions with a gentle smile. When my sister spoke over me, I let her. When my nephew corrected me unnecessarily, I thanked him. People mistake silence for surrender far too easily, and I allowed them that comfort. Meanwhile, my calendar quietly filled with appointments they knew nothing about. The attorney confirmed what I already suspected. Most of my assets were still entirely under my control because I had never finalized the changes my family assumed were done. The trust documents they believed existed were drafts, unsigned, unenforced. My financial advisor walked me through every account, every beneficiary designation, every clause that could be altered while I was alive and competent, which I was, unquestionably. We spoke not in emotional terms, but in options. Control is built through options. I authorized evaluations, not because I needed them, but because I knew my family's first move, if challenged, would be to question my capacity. So I preempted it. Independent doctors, clean reports, documentation stacked neatly and dated. By the time they ever thought to accuse, the evidence would already be waiting. I began restructuring quietly, moving assets into protections that could not be touched, redirecting beneficiaries to places and people my family would never expect, including charities I had supported anonymously for years. I didn't rush the process. Each signature was deliberate, each decision irreversible. At night, when the house went quiet, I sat alone and felt something unfamiliar, not bitterness, but relief. For the first time in decades, I wasn't planning around other people's comfort. I wasn't cushioning outcomes. I was simply deciding. And the more I decided, the clearer it became that the power they thought they were waiting to inherit had never left my hands. It had only been resting there, unnoticed, until I chose to use it. The turning point came not with confrontation, but with impatience, their impatience. Greed, I've learned, always rushes the timeline. My nephew began asking questions that were too specific to be casual. He wanted to know where certain documents were kept, whether I still remembered passwords, if I'd ever officially finalized anything with my advisors. My sister suggested, too gently, that it might be wise to consolidate everything before it became confusing. I nodded, agreed, thanked her for worrying about me. Inside, I noted the escalation. They were moving closer to action, and that meant I needed to be several steps ahead. I scheduled a family dinner and let them believe it was my idea of reconciliation, of closure. People let their guard down when they think they're about to win. Over roast chicken and polite laughter, they spoke openly about the future, about what would happen eventually, about how relieved I would be knowing everything was settled. I watched their faces as they talked, not with anger, but with a strange detachment, like observing a play where you already know the final act. The next morning, while they slept, I drove to the bank and finalized the last transfer. The trust was activated. The beneficiaries were locked. The protections were sealed. No amount of charm, pressure, or legal maneuvering could undo what had just been completed. I sat in my car afterward for a long moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, feeling the weight lift. This wasn't revenge fueled by hatred. It was accountability delivered with precision. They believed they were waiting for me to disappear. What they didn't understand was that while they waited, I had been rewriting the ending, quietly, thoroughly, and without asking permission. They noticed the shift almost immediately, though they couldn't name it. Conversations grew cautious. My sister stopped speaking in hypotheticals and started watching my reactions more closely. My nephew became restless, packing through rooms he once treated like trophies already won. That's the thing about control. When it slips, people feel it before they understand it. One afternoon, my sister finally asked outright if I'd made any changes lately. I looked at her, met her eyes calmly, and said I'd done what anyone sensible would do. I made sure my affairs reflected my wishes, not other people's expectations. The silence that followed was heavy, revealing. She tried to laugh it off, said she only meant for my peace of mind. I nodded. Peace of mind is priceless, I agreed. Later that week, the first crack appeared. A bank statement arrived addressed to me alone, not the shared mailing address they quietly switched months earlier. My nephew held it like evidence, confusion written across his face. I watched him read it, watched the realization flicker and disappear as he tried to convince himself it meant nothing. That night, I overheard whispers behind closed doors, urgency replacing confidence, irritation replacing patience. They were scrambling now, trying to piece together what they'd missed. And still, no one confronted me directly. That told me everything. They weren't angry because they'd been betrayed. They were afraid because they no longer knew where the ground beneath them stood. I slept soundly that night, not because the storm had passed, but because I knew I was finally standing outside of it. The confrontation, when it finally came, arrived disguised as concern. My sister suggested we sit down together, just the two of us, like we used to when we were younger. She chose a quiet afternoon, tea already poured, her tone careful and rehearsed. She asked how I was feeling, really feeling, and whether I was sure I wasn't overwhelmed by all the responsibilities I still carried. I listened without interrupting, recognizing the strategy immediately. When fear fails, people reach for doubt. I thanked her for caring and told her I felt clearer than I had in years. That answer unsettled her. She asked if I'd spoken to anyone professionally about my decisions. I told her yes, several people, in fact, and watched her expression tighten. She shifted tactics, reminding me of family, of loyalty, of everything we'd shared. I didn't argue. I simply told her that loyalty doesn't mean surrendering your life to people who have already decided how it should end. When she finally asked, directly, whether I'd changed the trust, I didn't deny it. I told her the truth in one sentence. Everything I worked for would now go exactly where I wanted it to go. No ambiguity, no loopholes. The color drained from her face, and for the first time, she looked at me not as someone fatting, but as someone who had just closed a door she assumed would always be open. She left shortly after, her tea untouched. That evening, my nephew tried his own approach, apologies mixed with nostalgia, promises layered with regret. I listened politely and told him something he hadn't expected to hear. Forgiveness doesn't restore access. Trust, once misused, doesn't reset on command. That was the moment they understood. Not fully, but enough. They weren't waiting anymore. They were too late. After that, the house felt different. Not tense, but exposed, like a stage after the curtain has fallen and everyone realizes the performance is over. My sister stopped pretending. My nephew stopped trying. The politeness faded, replaced by a brittle distance that told me they were recalculating, searching for another angle, another pressure point they might have missed. They spoke less around me, but I noticed how often they whispered when they thought I wasn't listening, how their plans grew vague, how certainty drained from their voices. One evening, I found my nephew in the study, standing too close to the filing cabinet, his hand resting on a drawer he had no reason to open. He jumped when he saw me, muttered something about looking for a pen. I smiled and handed him one from my pocket. I'd started carrying one everywhere, not because I needed it, but because it reminded me how much had changed. The next day, my attorney called to inform me that inquiries had been made, indirect ones about contesting my decisions. Capacity questions, procedural doubts, exactly what we'd anticipated. I told him to proceed as planned. Within hours, formal letters were sent, evaluations attached, authority clarified. The attempts dissolved before they could solidify. That was the moment I understood the full weight of what I'd done. I hadn't just protected my assets. I'd removed myself from the narrative they'd written for me, the patient old woman waiting quietly at the edge of her own life. I was no longer part of their future planning, and for the first time, that felt like freedom, not loss. What followed wasn't chaos or collapse, it was absence. My sister began staying out late, finding reasons not to be home. My nephew suddenly had work trips and obligations that kept him elsewhere. The house, once filled with quiet entitlement, became hollow, like a place people no longer knew how to inhabit without expectation. I noticed how quickly dependence fades when access is gone. I also noticed something else, how light I felt. I began reclaiming spaces that had slowly stopped feeling like mine. The garden out back where I'd once spent hours, the chair by the window no one ever sat in because it wasn't positioned for conversation or convenience. I reread old letters, reorganized shelves, donated things I'd kept only because others insisted they mattered. One afternoon, I found a photograph tucked inside a book. Me, years younger, standing in front of this very house on the day I bought it. I remembered how proud I'd been, how steady. That woman hadn't disappeared, she'd only been postponed. Friends I hadn't seen in years started coming by again, people who asked questions and waited for answers. I laughed more, slept better. And slowly, without announcement, I began planning the next chapter of my life, not around inheritance or obligation, but around intention. The irony wasn't lost on me. The moment they stopped counting my days, I finally started living them. The confrontation, when it finally came, was quieter than I expected. No shouting, no dramatic accusations, just a knock at the door one evening as the sun was slipping down, casting long shadows across the porch. My sister stood there first, eyes guarded, posture stiff, followed by my nephew, who suddenly looked much younger than his age. They didn't come with apologies, they came with confusion, with questions wrapped in concern that arrived far too late to be genuine. They asked why the accounts had changed, why the paperwork was so complicated, why I hadn't discussed any of it with them beforehand. I listened without interrupting, noticing how their words circled around inconvenience rather than emotion, disruption rather than relationship. When they finally paused, waiting for reassurance, I spoke calmly, about autonomy, about planning, about how love isn't proven through access to assets but through presence long before they're at stake. I told them I hadn't taken anything from them. I had simply stopped giving what was never theirs to claim. The silence that followed was heavy, not with regret, but with realization. They saw, perhaps for the first time, that I wasn't afraid of their disappointment, that I wasn't negotiating. And in that moment, I understood something deeply. Revenge doesn't always look like retaliation. Sometimes it looks like clarity, like standing firm without cruelty, like choosing yourself without needing anyone else to lose. After they left that evening, I didn't lock the door behind them out of anger. I locked it out of closure. The house settled into a silence that felt earned, not lonely. I walked through each room slowly, touching familiar surfaces, aware that for the first time in years, nothing here was waiting to be taken from me. Everything was simply mine. I thought about how easily people mistake patience for weakness, how often older women are written out of their own stories long before the last page is turned. I hadn't screamed. I hadn't exposed anyone publicly. I hadn't destroyed lives. I had done something far more permanent. I had removed myself from exploitation and reclaimed authorship over my future. That night, I slept deeply, not because I'd won, but because there was nothing left to defend. The ending they planned for me would never arrive. I had already rewritten it, quietly, deliberately, and entirely on my own terms. If this story resonated with you, let it serve as a reminder. Silence should never be mistaken for surrender, and kindness should never require self-erasure. Protect what you build, question who benefits from your patience, and never be afraid to reclaim your voice, no matter your age, no matter the cost. If you believe stories like this matter, take a moment to subscribe to Silver Reckoning Hub and become part of a community that honors truth, dignity, and quiet strength. Share this story with someone who needs it today and tell us in the comments, what would you have done differently?